Hello. So today I will be taking you through the process of making fermented green beans. There's nothing quite like a delicious fermented green bean. So, the first step in the process that I used to make these fermented green beans was create a brine from 1 gallon of water, and I dissolved 6 ounces of pickling salt into this warm water. Then I let it cool to room temperature. I took 2 pounds of fresh, clean green beans and packed them into a 2-gallon jar, layered with garlic cloves and fresh dill, as I will be able to show you here. So you can see the beans in there with the garlic and the fresh dill. And then I packed it really, really tightly and weighed it down with a Ziploc bag so that there was no oxygen in the top of the jar when I first started. This is because we want this fermentation to occur in an anaerobic environment so that the oxygen could bring into it other bacteria that we don't necessarily want to be growing in there because it could spoil the food or draw mold or other things into our actual brine. So I put a lid on my jar, covered it tightly to maintain a dark environment, and let it go. So I added the salt in the brine in order to draw water and nutrients from the beans and create this brine that inhibits most microbes other than lactic acid bacteria from growing. Leuconostoc mesenteroids, Lactobacillus plantarum, and Lactobacillus brevis are all bacteria that produce lactic acid, which helps lower the pH and inhibits the growth of other undesired microbes. The microbes give their beans their characteristic flavor and extends their storage life. The garlic and the fresh dill I added to the beans simply just to enhance the flavor of these beans, but they don't necessarily have a direct effect on the growth of different microbes or how the fermentation process actually happened. So the question arises, what metabolic processes are the microbes undergoing, and what specific byproducts are they producing that contribute to changes in the food that are going to actually ferment these beans? So the first microorganisms to start acting on this about 3 to 4 days into this process are the gas-producing cocci, also known as these L-mesenteroids. These microbes produce acids. When the acidity reaches 0.25 to 0.3%, these bacteria slow down and begin to die off, but their enzymes continue to function. The activity initiated by these L-mesenteroids continues by the lactobacilli until an acidity level of 1.5 to 2% is attained. The high salt concentration in this brine and the low temperature inhibit these bacteria to some extent. So that keeps the food from actually going bad and causing spoilage. Finally, Lactobacillus brevis continues the fermentation, bringing the acidity to 2 to 2.5%, thus completing this fermentation process. In the case of the fermentation of these beans, lactic acid bacteria is being produced and raises the pH level a bit above neutral, which the neutral pH level is about 7. Certain bacteria are acid tolerant and survive at these pH levels. These species include Lactobacillus and Streptococcus, which are helping ferment these beans. So the Lactobacillus is helping ferment those beans. The salt in the brine draws sugar and water out of the beans, which are these nutrients, and then those simultaneously reduce the salinity of the actual brine in the solution. A few days after the beans were covered in the brine, the fermentation began, and this generated some heat and started producing more acids and raising this acidity level. The color of the beans changed from like that really vibrant, fresh green bean look to a dark olive green, and as you could kind of see, they're a little bit translucent, and they just look like you could almost see through them. And this happened as the acids interacted with the chlorophyll in the vegetables. The beans also began to look more transparent because the air was being forced out of the cells, and the gravity of the beans also increased as a result of this gradual absorption of salt, and they began to sink in the brine rather than floating at the surface, which is where they were when I first started. The optimum temperature for vegetable fermentation is around 21 degrees Celsius. A variation of just a few degrees alters the activity of this microbial process and can affect the quality of the final product. Therefore, temperature control is one of the most important factors in the fermentation process. A temperature of 18 to 22 degrees Celsius is most desirable for initiating fermentation, since this is the optimum temperature range growth and metabolism of these L-mesenteroids, and temperatures above 22 degrees actually favor the growth of the different lactobacillus species. So it's a range in there. So what I did to keep that temperature was keep it in a room in my house that stays at pretty constant temperature all the time. The fermentation as the salt in the brine drew the oxygen out of the beans, it was obvious because you could see that the beans lowered, as I had mentioned before. The pH level became more acidic as the fermentation process advanced. So the fermentation of 1 mole of glucose yields 1 mole each of lactic acid, ethanol, and carbon dioxide. So in the case of my beans, 1 mole of sugar from the beans yielded 1 mole of lactic acid, ethanol, and carbon dioxide, which also aided in the fermentation process as well, but was not a drastic enough change to completely change the composition of the beans. Although they became more sour, they still look like a green bean. Only an extremely small amount of alcohol is produced in the fermentation of these beans, unlike if I was to, say, make beer, I would add sugar and yeast as well, and this would result in much higher alcohol levels in my finished product. These beans have been fermenting for about 16 days, so they definitely have a nice pickled flavor, but I still think they need a little bit more time. They're nice and crunchy, but they still have a little bit more of that bean flavor and less of the pickled flavor that I'm really looking for. I wouldn't really make any changes in this because I believe in the next few days these are going to be even more delicious than they already are. However, I may consider adding some other vegetables such as carrots to the mix and seeing how they react to the fermentation process. Since carrots have a little bit higher level of sugar, it'll be interesting to kind of see how that process evolves. Thank you so much, and try fermenting your own beans someday. It's a great project.